Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Weiss, co-chair of Steptoe's International Trade Policy Practice and lead of the firm's supply chain team. Welcome to Supply Chain University, where we dive into the legal, policy, and advocacy issues involving supply chains. To find out more, visit our website at steptoe.com. On this episode, we're talking about supply chain issues affecting the hemp industry with Delta Ag, the largest full-service provider of hemp in the United States. And we're joined by Graham Owens, the president of Delta Ag, and Nick Strawn, the chief operating officer and founder of Delta Ag. And Graham and Nick, we're really appreciative that you're joining us here today. Really excited to have you on Supply Chain University.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks for your time.
So Nick mentioned that you're the founder of Delta Ag. I was wondering whether you could give us some background on the origins of the company and how it was founded.
Yeah. So, again, first I'd like to start off by thanking you for the time. Appreciate being on here and the opportunity to educate everyone on hemp. When I started in oil and gas. I'm an attorney by trade. Started in land transactions and quickly kind of moved into a sector of the industry where we would go build land positions in league with private equity companies or operators, right? But my proficiency was dealing in fractured regulatory markets. And so as that kind of moved on, we built a family office on the back end of that oil company and started investing in cannabis. So a lot of similarities, with a fractured regulatory market, fractured supply chain, emerging market with volatile commodity prices. And so beyond that, from a supply chain perspective, upstream, midstream, and downstream components on most of the processing methods you'd see with the plant. So striking similarities to oil and gas at a high level. And so we saw the industrial hemp supply chain as a place particularly where we could overlay some of our expertise in building land-based production units, for lack of a better term, and take the plant and flip the production model on its head and figure out a way not to just produce it for one commodity, which is how it was traditionally produced, either specifically for grain or fiber or flour, and chase a tricrop, right? Meaning all three of those revenue streams from the plant. We were really the first group who decided let's implement production and large-scale agriculture processes like you'd see in cotton, corn, and implement them in the hemp space. So Delta Ag was pretty much bred out of wanting to, commoditize and bring kind of a real commercial and industrial approach to an emerging market. So Delta Ag's model is essentially we provide the farmer the genetics, they grow the plant for us, we advise them on how to grow it, we help them we actually come in and harvest it for them. And then we build a facility to process that plant and separate the plant into its derivative parts, being flour, fiber, and grain. Those things then go down for further downstream processing, but that is Delta Ag in a nutshell, the low-cost producer of hemp and all of its derivative raw goods. And in certain instances, we've started vertically integrating, but we'll get into that here shortly.
And so it sounds like you're basically, like you said, you're diversified into all three parts. Who are you typically selling to?
Good question. On the flower side, the CBD market's the primary revenue driver there. Since the 2018 Farm Bill, which pretty much legalized anything that was below 0.3% THC, which is what hemp is. Selling CBD and selling CBD into the products that you see on the shelves right now across the country, that's where most of the flower processing goes into. So there's a couple steps there between the flower itself and the end molecule, but that's the primary revenue driver there. On the grain side, you have everything from proteins to animal feed to fiber replacements with the husk itself to hemp seed oil. The market there is a lot more nuanced in that requires specialty processing, but there's a lot of high value uses there. Hemp seed oil, for instance, trades at a significantly higher value than the oil that's used to make CBD. And then lastly, on the fiber side or stock, right, we're taking that and they're separating it into two separate things. Bast, which is the outside part of it. If you think about the bark or the fibrous part of it, you can use that to make anything from textiles to interwovens to paper. And then hurd, which is the inner part of it. You think about the inner part of a stalk, and that's cellulose. So you can use that for anything from feed to absorbent products to bioplastics. And so these markets, particularly in the grain and fiber aspects, are emerging, but the demand's inexhaustible. So it's really just a race to see who can effectively build a supply chain, in a risk mitigated way and in line with how regulatory is going to unfold.
Yeah, and on that, I mean, Jeff, from my previous life coming from the National Association of Manufacturers, the two, the industrial side, really, the grain and the fiber, while they're emerging here, there are, for a little more established in countries that have had hemp programs for, throughout the entirety of our time having it illegal. And so you're seeing in Germany, BMW making their i3 cars using hemp, Nike's getting into it. So there's certainly the interest, and part of what piqued my interest in joining Delta Ag is the excitement on that side. So, of course, on the CBD side, it's hemp versus hemp, right? It's hemp's prime, but not only are we coming into this with a vastly behind of other grains, the rest of the world when it comes to hemp, we're also competing now with more traditional fibers, whether they be synthetic fibers or naturally occurring fibers, the ones that have traditionally been used for paper, like wood and others. And so it's exciting, but it's certainly, that's the next frontier. And we think hemp is particularly exciting because, one, we haven't had a new fiber in this country in a long time. And you're hearing that excitement from manufacturers. Like, what can we do with this? There's, so many uses. We're trying to kind of figure out exactly what the best use is sometimes. But they're good there, right? And the hemp's unique sequestration ability when it comes to sucking up carbon makes it a particularly interesting fiber, because it's that fiber, in fact, that is really what's sucking up the carbon. It actually binds with the carbon indefinitely, almost kind of creating a naturally occurring carbon fiber, which gives you this fiber with the tensile strength of steel if harvested correctly, and hence where you're making cars and hempcrete and all these really strong materials. So immensely exciting, and we're really, I'm really excited to plug hemp into those more established supply chains with those end product manufacturers.
And Graham brings up a good point. When we're thinking about the plant, given the carbon sequestration aspect of it, it's almost like it provides us a fourth revenue stream, right? As the emergence of carbon credits come out, and that really starts to take hold, that adds almost like a meta revenue stream to agriculture, and I think that can't be overlooked as you're building out a supply chain like that.
It's really exciting. As Graham, as we were talking about before, when you're creating a whole new supply chain, and obviously carbon footprint is going to be a big part of that, and you've made that one of your mantras, that you're going to be powering the carbon negative future. What are some of the, I guess, challenges and opportunities you've seen in terms of plugging hemp into the established manufacturing supply chains?
Do you want to start, Nick?
Yeah, I'll start on my side, and then you can hop in on the regulatory and the legal side of it. But from a practical perspective, it's been, the development of the hemp supply chain has been a very chicken or the egg kind of industry, right? The development has always been, well, if you guys go build it, they will come, right? That got the hemp industry off into a really bad start, right? With the legalization of the 2018 the passing of the 2018 Farm Bill, that was really the first chance to farm hemp at scale. And up and until then, it was mainly grown at a boutique level, and the sale and exit prices were extremely high. So you had an influx of people coming in and farming it in 2018 and then 2019, which caused a severe glut, right? And so Delta Ag's model was coming in and fixing a lot of that, fixing a lot of what was a gold rush mentality, and carrying this crop to a place where commoditization made sense, right? So part of our struggle was simply coming into a market that was already distressed. When we entered into the market to grow in 2020, growing and registered acres were cut by 50%. This upcoming year, I think it's higher than that, 70%. So our approach is very contrarian. While everyone was getting out of the upstream side of it because they saw an oversupply, we saw an opportunity to come in and change the cost model, change the way people were farming this, because at the end of the day, it is a commodity. And to expect that there's going to be a 500% margin on the plant forever doesn't exist, right? So a lot of my problems were getting this supply chain situated and getting the appropriate components in place, given that there had already been a collapse in the market, right? But Delta Ag, that ended up being a benefit for us. There's no institutional financing, or there wasn't institutional financing available until very recently, right? Institutional banks wouldn't bank hemp until very recently. We just started banking with Chase. Insurance programs have just come in the last 2 years. And so a lot of what happened in the first stage of, the hemp boom, happened because all of those things weren't available and the risk mitigation tools weren't available to them. And so if you're looking at from a policy perspective, how has it changed for us? We were able to come into a market that could be corrected and we were able to come in at a time, fortunately, where the institutional, groups, whether it was financing, insurance, capital providers, whatever it is, they all started to get comfortable with the plant itself. And so, I think that crescendos into a point that Graham can take over here. But, I think we're finally at a place where the regulatory environment and culture around cannabis in general, but more specifically hemp, and what we can do in the industrial sides of it on the grain and the fiber, those tailwinds are pretty strong, and so I think timing is fortunate in that you've got some groups coming in who have built businesses the way we have in the industry, and they prioritize the right things. And so regulatory and legal and legislative catalysts, they're going to be catalysts, right? They're not going to be detriments. Graham, would you say so?
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly a catalyst, and I think from my perspective, I can jump into the regulatory stuff in a minute, but I think there's sort of 2 or 3 main components that are slowly limiting, but we're working through, but have limited hemp's ability to get into the more established fiber and grain supply chains. One, of course, as Nick just went through, is that hemp is young, and just because the crop is legal to grow didn't mean that the rest of the important pieces he talked about, right? Farmers, to grow it, especially at these sort of real scale, they need to ensure that they're going to have loans available to them, right? They operate on loans most of the year for their crops. They need to make sure that they're, they have insurance for those crops if they have a bad year, right? Those are things you're going to need from the farmer level. Banking, capital, access capital, all these things, slowly are coming later, but they weren't all ushered in right at the same time. It was legal to grow, but there's a lot more to it, particularly if you want to grow at any sort of scale. And that leads to number 2, which is, in fact, volume, scale. When you're talking about CBD, I think, Nick, tell me if I'm wrong, it's like 10 or 15,000 acres of hemp could more or less supply most of the CBD market in this country, maybe, give or take. But if you're thinking about what large, international manufacturers, whether it's textile, automobiles like BMW I mentioned, or Ford, that's looking into it, or, think of packaging for large consumer brands, right? They need a lot. And they really need significant volumes. And so, to move in, there's sort of that reticence. We want to, the industry needs to mature, and there needs to be a sufficient volume available for us to go in. We don't want to make 3 T-shirts out of hemp. We want to make a whole line of it, right? And so that's where you kind of, the industry needs to catch up, and that's where we kind of come in, as again providing that scale. For the first time in this country, and using big ag practices that allow us to keep our costs lower. So volume being number 2. And I think number 3 is really, it's somewhat regulatorily and somewhat just a lack of understanding of hemp. We're still working through the hemp is not marijuana, concern a lot of folks have. I always use the analogy of, a golden retriever and a Labrador retriever are both canines. they can often look the same, but they have very different personalities, and so hemp is not marijuana. So we always have to start even there. And so for these big in-product manufacturers, they have their reputations. They're still kind of slowly. They spent most of their lives with the idea that hemp is illegal, and so to quickly jump in just is not sort of in their nature. And we're both, of course, attorneys, and you as well. So we love risk averseness, right? Yeah. But so I think they're warming up to it when the volume is there, when they feel like they're not going to come into any issues with their banking practices by engaging with hemp, because as he mentioned, we weren't even able to bank with hemp. And so what would that have done if you had started using hemp as an input product to your ability to seek investors and to bank, right? All of those concerns are slowly being addressed. And I think that will kind of change the misconception of hemp as of some sort of, drug, when it's really, especially when you're talking hemp fiber or grain, it's just a commodity. It's no different than any other row crop commodity. It's, high in protein. It's been designated by FDA as generally recognized as safe. You can buy it at Whole Foods or Trader Joe's, right? Those misconceptions are coming, but it just takes a little bit of time, and that's sort of the fun of what we have the opportunity here to do is build that from scratch and try to plug those in the right ways, in efficient ways, and environmentally friendly ways.
So it sounds like things are moving in the right direction on the finance side. Assuming that you as you said, you're going to be scaling up to try to tackle some of these really big issues. What are some of those issues that you think you might be able to tackle? Like, are you talking about like animal feed and grain shortages, or like what do you want to focus on?
Yeah, so on the feed side, so that's actually something going back a little bit on the regulatory piece. Even though I just mentioned FDA has recognized hemp and hemp grain as GRAS, generally recognized as safe, and you and I and humans can eat it, it actually isn't legal to sell commercially as animal feed yet. And some states have opened those markets at state level, but the FDA federally has not. And a lot of that goes back to when the FD&C Act was passed. Hemp was illegal; it wasn't grandfathered in, and it was sort of perhaps maybe a unintended consequences of the way that they drafted the 2018 Farm Bill and legalization of hemp. But that's a huge market. And of course that, the FDA wants to see studies, and we're working hard to provide those studies, the industry and Delta Ag. But that's, a huge regulatory roadblock. And it's at a time when, as you said, there is a global animal feed and grain shortage. And it is wreaking havoc across supply chains. It's difficult for even the large protein producers to find the grain they need to feed their chickens, and so they're going to Brazil and importing 30 million pounds of soy when U.S. is traditionally one of the top 2 or 3 biggest exporters of soy. Right? It's just not available, and a lot of that is driven by drought. Meanwhile, we do have some estimates of over 200 million pounds of hemp grain that will be available after the end of this year. And so you have a huge supply that could go a long way towards alleviating a lot of those supply chain issues, and ensuring that, we don't have food shortages because cattle ranchers had to sell off their animals because they couldn't feed them, or, crops here couldn't grow. We have a crop that doesn't need as much water as its other row crop grains. It needs significantly less water, so it's able to weather those crops, and we have a huge abundance. And so we have been actively, us again as Delta Ag and really the industry as a whole, trying to work with legislatures and regulators and seeing if there isn't a pathway maybe towards opening the animal feed markets for animals not meant for human consumption, so that we have more time to study those that do end up in human consumption. But that opens up feed for the animals meant for human consumption, and would at least provide a bit of relief. Maybe it doesn't fix the entire issue, right? But it could go a long way towards allowing U.S. farmers to support U.S. ranchers.
Yeah, no, it definitely sounds like something that, as you know, the administration is going through a supply chain review right now, and one of the industrial bases that they're focusing on is food and commodities. And I think there's a report due to the president by February 2022, and this sounds like something that they should be focused on in that review. Are there other policy tools you think could be used, whether at the federal or state level, that would be helpful for building out the supply chain?
I think it's a bit of both. There's opportunities at the federal and state level, and we're actively pursuing those. I'm always heartened when Chairman Scott held the House Ag Committee recently last week held a hearing specifically on issues with our food supply. Next week, it looks like they're holding a hearing on trade issues. I mean, they are looking and analyzing the right issues at the right time. So we believe, of course, at the federal level, working with and engaging with those committees. Senator Stabenow and the Senate Ag Committee have also been engaged. We recently went to the NASDA conference, which is the National Association of the State Departments of Agriculture, at the behest and guidance of Senator Stabenow and the Senate Ag Committee through the National Industrial Hemp Council, which we're members, and I'm the co-chair of their Government Affairs Committee, to listen and hear from the states. And the states are also willing. They were happy to have an opportunity to share their experiences with their hemp programs. Talk about the issues they're facing, what in future farm bills could make their lives a lot easier and improve the progress. So I think there's opportunities both at the state level, and it's what exactly those tools are. I think one is the testing standard for hemp is currently, as Nick said, 0.3%. That number was really just sort of an arbitrary starting point. Well, we had to start somewhere on what the differentiation is, but it's really creates a lot of hardships for farmers and meeting that standard. Crops can go hot. So even just increasing that to 1%, which of course would not in any way enable you to get high any more than, eating too, you can eat too much sugar, you can eat too much sodium, but 1% is still a very negligible number, but would go a long way towards opening up markets, ensuring farmers feel safe and that they're going to meet the testing requirements, that the crop doesn't go hot and suddenly they're, on the wrong side of a test. So we think that number one would go a long way. And I didn't hear from almost all states we spoke to supported a 1% standard. Nobody opposed it. And most states noted that one of the biggest concerns they have when switching from the 2014 Farm Bill program, which opened it up for research, and the 2018 Farm Bill are the rigorous testing requirements, where some states are we don't even have the infrastructure to do this. So really, I think working with the states and finding a way to create a safe but workable testing standard and maybe creating sort of uniform testing standards across the industry would go a long way. Of course, opening up the animal feed markets, especially in the short term to address this global feed shortage, would not only go a long way towards providing a huge revenue stream for the industry, but also allowing us to actually provide those studies that the FDA and other regulatory agencies are looking for, right? It's another chicken and the egg situation. Well, we need more studies. Well, we're a young industry that's not flush with cash yet. These are expensive studies, right? This would allow us to bring in revenue and to study these effects in real time on animals not meant for human consumption. So to me, those are some of the two low-hanging fruit that policymakers can do, whether it's at the state or federal level. Montana has opened up animal feed to some extent more recently, and other states are looking at it. I know Texas had a bill that didn't quite make it this past time, but are looking at it. So states are certainly leading the way, as they typically are, in terms of being that incubator of policy ideas and sort of a testing ground. And then I think what the government, at all levels should really be doing is rather than assuming, is pulling together some sort of hemp, committee or advisory group, whether it be an FDA, USDA sort of joint group, but an advisory committee made up of industry, academic experts, policymakers, local and leaders to talk through these issues, share ideas, and really come up with a plan to move forward. I think that is the easiest thing to do. Is you see the FCC did this with their Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee to try. The government does this very often to address some of our nation's biggest problems, and I think that should and hopefully will be done in the near future, because it would go a long way to just giving the industry and the farmers a voice and sharing. How do we open this market? How do we make sure that we have an opportunity to build the supply chain from scratch to get it right? How do we do that?
Yeah, and it sounds like one of the challenges, as you mentioned, is you have different states, potentially different testing standards. So it seems like bringing everyone together at the policy level to talk about some of these issues. It also seems like developing voluntary consensus standards could be a way forward as well. If you have everyone participating and then all the states could adopt the same standard. And I mean, is that something you think the industry is looking at long term as well?
Absolutely. I know we've been involved. ASTM and other voluntary standard setting agencies have cannabis programs. They are actively looking at that, which is something we, of course, need. I think you see from any sector of manufacturing and ag or elsewhere, the standard, those industries that really thrive are self-regulators. They do take the step to identify, a lot of times the voluntary standards are more stringent than the safety standards set out by maybe the Consumer Product Safety Commission even, right? And so I think that we are looking at that and working with those groups. It is, again, developing these requires resources, and I think going back, providing funding to help bring these groups together would go a long way. But we are actively looking at it. It is certainly critical to the industry to have those voluntary standards.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Graham and Nick, for coming on. Really appreciate it and hearing your insights. It's really exciting what you're doing, and I look forward to seeing continued growth in the company and the industry. With Delta Ag leading the way. So again, thanks again for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you for all your time.
And that's it for this edition of Supply Chain University. You can find this in all of our videos at steptoe.com. You can also find us on YouTube, where you can like and subscribe. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thanks everyone.